It was February 23rd, 1945, and three preteen boys, Larry Bailey, Bob, and Ken Fine, were playing at their farm out here north of Dorr, Michigan, when one of them spotted a blob floating in the sky that was coming down at a slow angle. It landed about a half a mile from them, and they were pretty excited. They had never seen anything like it. And a visiting neighbor, Joe Wolf, offered to give them a ride to go check it out in his pickup. And when they arrived, about 50 yards off this road, 21st Street, they saw a deflated canopy with some ropes hanging off it. And they suspected it was a balloon, but it had a charred platform. So they hooked it up to the pickup truck, they dragged it back to the house, pulled it in the back door, and stuffed it down in the basement. They didn't know what to do with it, but they had some pretty cool ropes hanging off it. You know, ropes were scarce during World War II. And Mrs. Fine summoned the local parish priest because it was a Catholic neighborhood back there, and if you found anything unusual, you called the priest. The priest inspected it, and he suggested they call law enforcement. So they contacted law enforcement, and two deputies from the Kent County Sheriff's Department arrived, and they thought it might be a weather balloon. So they contacted the local weather bureau, and the local weather bureau said, nope, that's not ours. So apparently they contacted the feds, and the next day the balloon was gone, confiscated by the feds, and everyone was told to forget that this happened and that to go about their lives as if they had never found this object. And what did they find? Well, technically they found a weapon of war that was designed to attack American soil, and it was launched from the mainland of Japan. I'm Chuck, the channel's Restless Viking. Let's explore this interesting piece of Great Lakes history. Bailey and the Fine boys observed and secured what is called a Fugo bomb. From November of 1944 to April of 1945, the Japanese launched about 9,300 balloons from the mainland of Japan. About 300 were officially documented as being found or observed in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. They reportedly got as far east as Michigan. The bomb was developed as a cheap way to strike the mainland of the United States, cause a bit of panic, and take resources away from the war effort to deal with them. They were meant to travel in the winter jet stream when the winds were the strongest to reach North America. This story of the Fugo bombs isn't well known, let alone that some landed in Michigan. And why? Well, the US government's Office of Censorship had requested that no stories about the balloons be published or broadcast. And except for a story or two, they complied. They didn't want panic, nor did they want the Japanese to know about their success or failure. Since there was almost nothing in the news, the Japanese didn't know if their attacks were working. Eventually, about 15 years later, the documents regarding those balloons were declassified. But by then, no one really paid attention. Now, these balloons were quite a piece of engineering. It was the first weapon to achieve intercontinental range, and the Fugo's flights were the longest range attacks in the history of warfare at the time. The balloons were filled with hydrogen and were 33 feet in diameter. The skin was made of washi paper that was laminated and glued together by thousands of Japanese high school girls across Japan. They were normally deployed with two 11-pound incendiary devices and a 33-pound anti-personnel bomb. To reach North America, they had a sophisticated system that would release hydrogen gas in the heat of the day so they wouldn't go too high. And at night, when they got too low, they would drop a couple of their 32-pound sandbags. Then they would gain elevation. Meanwhile, the jet stream would carry the balloon sometimes faster than American fighter planes and at altitudes beyond their reach. Later, and the hope was the balloons would be over North America, a separate system would release the bombs, and soon after a self-destruct mechanism would destroy the carriage and ignite the hydrogen. This took some advanced weather knowledge and a lot of calculations. You take my point, of course, they were pretty sophisticated weapons for a balloon. The intended objective of the balloons was to start forest fires in the Pacific Northwest. But 1945 was a very wet year in Western North America, so they weren't very effective. One balloon did tangle in power lines in Washington State, cutting power to a plutonium manufacturing facility for the Manhattan Project. And they caused 6 civilian deaths when a pastor, his pregnant wife, and some Sunday school students tried dragging a fallen balloon out of a forest near Bly, Oregon. While the Reverend Archie Mitchell was parking the car, the bomb exploded, killing his wife Elsie, and Edward J. and Joan, 13 years old, Dick, 14, and Sherman, age 11. One of those balloons landed here, southwest of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and another landed here in Farmington, Michigan. In late March of 1945, about a month after Bailey and the Fine Boys discovered their balloon, Mr. and Mrs. Het were spending their Sunday afternoon in late March. Mrs. Het heard a sound similar to a shot. She investigated and saw a fire in an empty lot about 200 yards away. She called her husband over, who thought it might be a bonfire, but after about 3 minutes, the fire began to spurt, and Mr. Het said it was similar to those which he had seen caused by magnesium. Mr. Het, as it turns out, was a sergeant in the Michigan State Police. The fire subsided and the Hets dismissed it. But then, almost 2 months later, their neighbor, John Cook, brought over a cylindrical object he found while tending his garden. Mr. Cook had found it in April and thought it was just a shiny tin can. He tossed it aside, and in June, he found it again. But the next day, he saw a story in the newspaper about Japanese balloon bombs. After the deadly incident in Oregon, the press started reporting on the balloons to warn citizens of their potential danger and to report anything suspicious. Mr. Cook thought it might be part of a balloon bomb. Being that Mr. Het was with the Michigan State Police, Mr. Cook brought it over to show him. It was about 13 inches in circumference and 9 inches tall. It had a 3 3/4-inch wooden plug and unusual grooves in the top. It was turned over to Army Intelligence in Detroit, Michigan. An Army Intelligence report dated 10 days later confirmed it was the lower portion of a Japanese incendiary bomb. It appears this bomb was one of the few that completed its mission of igniting, but failed to harm anyone or cause any relevant damage. It exploded, caused a fire, and the balloon apparently floated away, probably self-destructing later. Officially, the North Door and Farmington bombs were the only ones that made it to Michigan. But a few experts believe that it is possible that over 1,000 made it to North America. Official reports are a good source of history, but what about those unofficial reports, those eyewitness reports, when someone reports something, but it doesn't make it to official channels? Like the one from a small town in northern Michigan, Miyawataka. In the spring of 1945, Don and Wendell Wing were on a shed roof in Cadillac, Michigan. Don rolled off the roof and noticed what looked like a bright silver dot floating in the sky, and it was getting closer. After a bit, they could see something hanging from it. Wendell recalls that it got low about 1,500 feet. The balloons were long tubes anywhere from 16 to 18 feet long. After we saw the first one, we observed 2 or 3 others that were higher in elevation. We didn't know what they were. They drifted over Cadillac, then west toward the little town of Miyawataka. Wendell, Don, and the rest of the Wing family piled into their 32 Chevy and gave chase. It seemed they wanted to tell their uncle about the balloons as they floated toward their uncle's house. When they arrived at the Miyawataka General Store, one of the bombs had already landed and exploded. Another eyewitness, Nancy Sanders, said that a balloon had landed and it, quote, made a deep hole about 12 inches deep and 6 feet wide and had detonated and burned the faces of a lot of people who were there at the time. No one was killed, however. Mr. Wing recalled, quote, one of the balloon bombs had come down and exploded. Chemicals from it had burned people, end quote. The Miyawataka incident never made it into the official records. These eyewitness accounts seem to match other incidents in the official record. It seems like the Miyawataka bomb incident has a lot of merit, but it would take other records corroborating the story to give it strong legitimacy in the history of the Michigan Fugo bombs. And if anyone out there has information, please post it below. There were other possible bomb sightings reported, like this one that mentions the balloon near Sault Ste. Marie. The Navy apparently dispatched a plane. It climbed to 7,000 feet, but couldn't catch up. To be sure, the Fugo balloons were a clever device. The Japanese had allocated 3 battalions of about 1,500 personnel to launch Fugos. They started launching from 3 sites on Japan's mainland starting in November of 1944. They could launch about 200 balloons a day and planned to send 15,000 by March of 1945. The United States was a little baffled at first, but was equally clever in determining what they were up against based on scant evidence. They pinpointed where the devices were made by analyzing the sand in the sandbags. At first, they thought they might be launched from POW camps or Japanese internment camps. Then they thought it might be from submarines. Eventually, they figured out that they were launching from Japan. The Japanese didn't get a lot of feedback about the bombs, just a single news article about a balloon discovered in Wyoming. So it seems the voluntary censorship worked well. In February of 1945, Japanese propaganda started claiming that there were great fires in the United States and the public was in panic and hundreds to thousands of casualties. Obviously, it wasn't true. The United States organized the Firefly Project, which involved 2,700 men, including 200 from the 555th Parachute Infantry Regiment, or the all-black airborne unit, Triple Nickels. The project was started to provide a quick response to the fires that may be started by the balloons. Many paratroopers from the Triple Nickels jumped into the fires to fight them, earning the unit the nickname Smoke Jumpers. Japan lacked the resources to continue manufacturing the balloons by mid-April of 1945. They had almost no knowledge if the balloons were reaching North America, let alone causing any damage. The campaign was stopped, with no plans to restart it. After the war, remains of the balloons were discovered, including 8 in the 40s, 3 in the 1950s, 2 in the 60s, and 1 in the 70s. In British Columbia, a live bomb was discovered in 2014, and the remains of a balloon as late as 2019. There are probably still remains of the balloons in the wilderness, and still today it seems that balloons can provide some military benefit. The recent hubbub about the Chinese spy balloon has renewed awareness that balloons are still used by states to gather intelligence of other countries. I'm Chuck, the channel's Restless Viking. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next adventure.